You're listening to Beyond the Pale on WBAI 99.5 FM in New York and streaming live at WBAI.org. I'm Kira Feldman.
And I'm Marissa Brostoff. Next up, you'll be hearing our interview with performance artist, playwright, and singer-songwriter Dan Fishback about his new performance piece, 30nothing, developed through a residency at Brooklyn Arts Exchange and playing there next weekend. What did it mean to be a gay Jewish child growing up in the 1980s? For Dan, it meant never being told much about the AIDS crisis unfolding during those years for gay men sometimes just a few years older than himself, coupled with lots and lots of precocious knowledge about the Holocaust. The stuff of future psychological complexes? Indeed. Dan, tell us about the genesis of 30nothing.
My thinking for the show started a few years ago while I was watching this really incredible documentary about Quentin Crisp called Resident Alien. And there's a sort of minor scene in the film where he is hanging out with the painter Patrick Angus, and he brings Patrick to a gallery to show his work. And the paintings are, like, unbelievable. And I was sitting there with my friend Dave, and we, like, completely freaked out. We were just like, oh my God, this guy's a genius, and his work is sort of about the awkwardness of gay sexuality, and I had always really resisted the way gay sexuality was presented by gay men to other gay men. I always felt very outside of that. So to see a gay artist presenting gay sexuality in all of its sort of weird, awkward complexities, I felt so acknowledged. And it was an experience I had never really had before, or had only had from people my own age, my contemporaries, my friends. I just started thinking, if I've never heard of this person, how many other artists who died when I was a child did I not know about, whose work would have helped me and made me feel less alone? My process for the show was just going out and finding out about as many gay artists who died of AIDS as possible. Just like learning their names, what they did, what their work was like, and taking the people whose work resonated with me and trying to build a show around that and juxtaposing the work that they were making in the 80s and early 90s with the things that were happening in my childhood at the same time to see if there was any intersection. And really the show tries to take what is generally thought of as two stories, the story of gay adults in the 80s and early 90s and the story of gay children in the 80s and early 90s, and saying, actually, guys, this is one story, and this is one thing that happened to one community at the same time.
It seems like one of the ironies in the show that's really central is that as you were growing up, you were being inundated with Holocaust education and getting almost no AIDS education when that was, in fact, the crisis of your people, as it were, that was actually happening at the moment.
When you grow up Jewish in the way that I grew up Jewish, you learn a process of mourning, of collective mourning. You learn how to make collective mourning the basis of justice, the basis of action, the basis of life, the basis of feeling, the basis of relating to other people. And in some ways, that's a totally messed up way to live and makes people neurotic. And in other ways, it's a really beautiful way to live your life. And so maybe only like 10% or 20% of the show is directly addressing Jewish issues. The entire show to me feels like a Jewish exercise because I'm applying the principles of Jewish collective mourning to the catastrophe of the early years of AIDS, which I feel has never been addressed, even within the gay community. I think there's a tremendous urge to feel like AIDS cannot be seen as something in the past. But the fact is, we are living in a city where thousands of the same kind of person died in the course of 15 years. And these are the people who made culture, and they were obliterated. And that is something that needs to be mourned. Similarly, with the Holocaust, like in the decade or so afterwards, there wasn't a lot of public conversation about it. And I think it's the same with AIDS in the gay community, where like now that it's 15 years since protease inhibitors started extending people's lives, or extending the lives of people with access to drugs, which is an important distinction. 15 years since it ceased to be a mass death experience of a discrete community. Kids need to look at that in this holistic and more textured way than I learned about the Holocaust.
Do you feel like people in your queer community are going through that same kind of process of trying to rediscover a heritage or construct a heritage?
Gay and lesbian, quote-unquote, history is something that exists, but it's not something that it's not passed on. My parents are amazingly supportive parents. My dad is a spokesperson for PFLAG. It never occurred to them to say to their gay son who came out when he was 15, I came out when I was 15 years old, it never occurred to them to be like, you should learn about the history of your people. And we should find a gay person, or we should research or something so that we can find someone to tell you and share with you the history and struggles of your people. No one can feel whole as a person, I think, unless they know where they come from, unless they feel a relationship to their history. And so I think that a lot of queer artists my age, right now at this very moment, are starting to really grapple with that. Especially gay men of my generation are hitting 30, and we're becoming adults, and we're looking around for paradigms of gay adulthood.
Because
and
to be gay is to be adopted.
To be gay is to say, I have this family, and then I have this other family that I'm going to assemble. I'm going to have my biological family, and I'm going to have my chosen family. And for some people, that means that they can't be with their biological family, that they have to get rid of it, and they can only be with their chosen family. And for some people like me, I have both, and I love both, and I need both. But I need both to be real, and I need both to have a past, and I need both to feel like not fantasies.
You say in your show, all Jewish children live in a world of secret adult truths. Things your Christian friends must be told are things you have always known, not only about Santa and Jesus, but also about the Holocaust. I've often wished that my parents had kept the Holocaust a secret until I was maybe 12 or 13 years old, so it could have been a surprise, something I'd have to grapple with a semi-formed conscience and a proto-adult sense of proportion, like the kids in my 7th grade class who had never heard of Anne Frank and had nervous breakdowns on the field trip to the Holocaust Museum. I'm wondering if you think there's a connection between Jewishness for you and queerness as a kind of as sources of secret knowledge.
This sort of lovely intersection of queerness and Jewishness is that we're both outside and inside at the same time. You know, when you're Jewish, you're sort of a part of everything, and you're sort of not a part of anything. And when you're queer, you're sort of a part of everything, and you're sort of not a part of everything. And I mean, I find it very difficult to tell the difference between Jewishness and queerness. And I think that's why the two blend so much in my work, because to me, they're both just different ways of being outside and looking in, and different ways of distance. In a way, being Jewish taught me how to be queer. Being queer is also being diasporic. You know, being queer, I mean, there is no queer homeland. And I mean, there are people who are endeavoring to make tiny little mini queer homelands all over the world, and I'm thankful for that. But we are a people who are in exile from nothing. And I think that's why so many Jewish queer people find it easier to settle into their queerness than other kinds of people, because we're trained to do that. We know what that's like. That's normal.
You talk in 30nothing about a lot of different aspects of your relationship to death and to suffering. There's a kind of survivor's guilt, you might say, in relation to both the trauma of AIDS and the trauma of the Holocaust. There's a kind of erotics of suffering. There's dark humor. There's the overexposure maybe to the Holocaust that you experienced as a kid, coupled with an underexposure to knowledge of the news unfolding in the AIDS crisis every day. Do you have some sense of how these different pieces relate to each other?
To me, all of these things feel like the same thing. If I can't understand death, how am I going to understand my past? And how am I going to understand my people? And how am I going to understand what it means to have sex with someone? Honestly, if I can't understand what it means to die, how do I understand what it means to love? I didn't want to get too much into survivor's guilt in the show, but I think that there is a strong sense that on some level, I do feel this very bittersweet pressure to live up to the work of my predecessors. It's not like in a like a Harold Bloom kind of anxiety of influence way. It's just like, looking back on all these amazing queer men who died, I need to live up to the standard that they created, not just in terms of my art, but in terms of my life. You know, these are trailblazers of cultural work, not just of art making, but of saying this is going to be the new way that we live. This is how we as queer people are going to live our lives. These people had fewer precedents than I did, and they had to make things up as they went along. And I'm so inspired by that. And there are times I can see older queer people, oftentimes older queer women, looking at my peers or looking at me, and I can tell that in the back of their minds they're thinking, we're the age that their friends were when their friends died. And we're in the same professions that their friends were in. We're making the same kind of work. And I'm always just like, oh, I bet we don't live up. I bet we don't live up to this. I bet they're all disappointed in us. Maybe that's just like a mommy issue that I have. Maybe I'm just used to knowing what it's like for a middle-aged woman to be disappointed in me. I worry about that.
There's a pervasive sense in the show of the struggle to try and simultaneously play the role of the flaming queer on the one hand and the neurotic Jew on the other hand. And that got me wondering where you do or don't identify with an older generation of writers and artists who have made a career out of combining in different ways those personas. So I'm thinking of somebody like Sarah Schulman, who you talk about in the show, and to me, the most obvious sort of forerunner there would be Tony Kushner. We actually had people on Beyond the Pale a couple of months ago talking about the legacy of Angels in America. How do you relate to that voice and that body of work? Are there places where you feel like you have insights as a person of your generation that someone like Kushner didn't have access to?
I don't feel artistically influenced by either of the people that you mentioned, but I do feel in my life inspired by their work, both of them, that I feel challenged to be a better and more ethical person. And the thing that challenges me to do that is through seeing characters that are very flaming and very neurotic, people who think about these things. The reason why the work of some queer Jewish artists has a similar sense of hilarious epistemological panic. I think that the notion of anxiety of influence is a very straight dude thing. I think that the rest of us really don't care. I feel an enormous sense of solace when someone else makes work that has the same concerns as mine. I never think, oh no, that's my thing.
You've been talking a lot about the people who you feel like have written for you. Who do you feel like you're writing for?
I could say that I'm writing for everybody, and I'd be lying. With this piece, I am most interested in addressing younger queer men, mostly because I feel like as a younger queer person, I feel like there's a huge amount missing in my sense of where my place is in the world. And I feel like this show, if it doesn't provide answers, it at least points people in the right direction where they can find their own answers. I also really, really want older queer men to experience the show. So far, every conversation I've had with an older queer man who's seen the show every conversation has changed my life so far. And I want this show to be able to facilitate intergenerational dialogue. There is very, very little intergenerational dialogue in the queer community, and I think that needs to end. I think that the show is something that anyone can work their way into simply because, on its most basic level, this show is about death. Obviously, death applies to everyone, but I feel like there is a way that anyone can find their path into the show because the show deals with some very, very basic anxieties that any sane, caring person would have. What do my friends mean to me? What does my family mean to me? What do my ancestors mean to me? There's no one to whom that doesn't apply. Luckily, it's kind of a funny show. I keep telling people like I'm doing a solo performance about AIDS and the Holocaust. Everyone's faces drop like, oh, as though they have to console me because it must be so hard. And I'm like, actually, it's been a really rewarding process, and it's kind of a funny show.
Dan Fishback, thanks for coming on Beyond the Pale.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.